I guess modern economics as a scientific doctrine begins with Cantillon, Richard Cantillon, who's a very interesting character too, and really with Cantillon, who's hardly talked about. But to put in a plug for myself, the Journal of Libertarian Studies, the current issue, now out, is an old Cantillon issue. About the most stuff that's ever been written on Cantillon. It came out of a conference on Cantillon several years ago. Cantillon has essentially the praxeological methodology. He's got the methodology of abstract reasoning. He starts off with a world of one landlord. In other words, one landlord owns the whole country. Not so far off, because the French situation was you had landlords and you had farmers. So landlords, absentee landlords, who gotten the land through conquest, and they would lease the land of farmers, and then you had other people. So you start off with one land. What happens with him? And they bring in more people, sort of like Rousseau economics. It's an excellent methodological presentation. His theory of utility, a value is essentially utility theory. He's also the first person to really talk about entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is uncertainty, bearing uncertainty. Brings an entrepreneur into economic thought. The theory of money was magnificent. He had the whole Hume theory except it was a process analysis. Like I use that evil word. And it was not equilibrium. In other words, it was equilibrium, but it was the process toward equilibrium. So you have, in British classical economics, of course, you have different equilibrium states. You have this state and that state. You leap somehow magically from one to the other. I talk only about the equilibrium state. With Cantillon, you talk about the process toward the new equilibrium. For example, so when Cantillon talks about what happens when the money supply increases in a country, he talks about how it's very Misesian, so to speak, pre-Misesian. It's well, first people get it, they get the new money, they spend more, prices go up as they spend it, and their goods that they buy, and then it percolates to other people. You have sort of a rippling out effect, and each group gets it until finally you have say if you double the money supply, finally you wind up with prices more or less double, but not completely, because you have a different equilibrium now. You have different wealth effects, etc. And it's a very sophisticated, excellent analysis of international, like so-called Hume species flow analysis, except Cantillon is much better than Hume. Hume was writing about the same time, a little bit later. Actually, no, this is, say, 1730s, and Hume wrote in the 1750s. Hume might probably read it, and all these guys knew each other. The British knew the French stuff. With Cantillon, you have a pre-Austrian analysis, no question about it. The process thing with individuals, starting with the micro-individuals, they get new money, they spend it, and so you wind up with let's say, a doubling of prices, but not automatic doubling. You have difference in price, relative prices. On the other hand, Hume, who was a Scotsman, part of the British tradition, was a brilliant writer. I have to concede with Hume. He's one of the few people in history of thought who's a great writer, although a confused thinker. Usually confusion and good writing good writing and clarity of thought come together. Confusion and bad writing come together. In case of Hume, his writing was better than his theories, so to speak. Anyway, with Hume, you have a pure pre-Friedmanite, pre-monetarist analysis. In other words, it's all equilibrium states. As a matter of fact, there's a famous example which Mises uses. It's a good first approximation of what happens with money. What I call the Angel Gabriel model. In other words, you're sleeping overnight. Overnight, the Angel Gabriel descends to man. They hear that mankind is always bellyaching, we haven't got enough money. The Angel Gabriel, benevolent but confused, but a lousy economist, says, okay, I'll fix these guys up, I'll double their money supply, and then they'll shut up, they'll satisfy their complaints. So overnight, everybody's money supply gets doubled magically. Your bank account, your wallet, your purse, etc. gets doubled. And Hume talks about it. He doesn't say that, he doesn't use the word Angel Gabriel model, that's basically what it is. And then what happens? Well, then everybody rushes out, spends it, and then according to Hume, prices overall double, and that's it. In other words, you leap quickly from the one equilibrium state to the other equilibrium state without talking about the process. With Cantillon, it's very different. You have different people benefit and different people lose out. I mean, in this model, for example, the guys who know what's going on rush out at 6 in the morning or 8 in the morning and spend everything immediately. The other guys who decide to save it, of course, are shafted because they find the prices have doubled before they get around to spending it. So there are differences in sort of benefits or burdens. So with Hume, a very good analysis is the first approximation of how the money supply increases prices, but you blot out the essential pre-Austrian process and differences in micro level. You just talk about the macro. This is the beginning, by the way, of the disastrous split between micro and macro, which begins with Hume and ends with Ricardo, as the final classic example, or ends with Ricardo and continues ever since. In the pre-Austrian analysis, Cantillon and Turgot, all these people, there's no split between micro and macro. Everything is an individual process which has different social results. It's only with, let's say, the British that you have this micro, they have things going on in the micro world with supply and demand, and suddenly in the macro world you have quantity and velocity and all that. It's totally different. So there's no relationship between the two of them. And Cantillon, I should say something about Cantillon the man, Richard Cantillon. He's a fascinating figure. One of the reasons why he's so good about money is he was a great monetary practitioner. He was an Irish Catholic banker who moved to the Jacobite court in France where the Stuart Pretender was located, and he became a banker. His cousins were all, it was very confusing because his cousins were all named Richard, and his uncles were named Richard. About 8 Richard Cantillons, and it was easy to get confused. There's one great Cantillon expert, Antoine Murphy, University of Dublin, who was the big expert on the Cantillon family. He worked the whole thing out, genealogical map. At any rate, Cantillon he becomes the banker to Stuart Pretender, and becomes a big shot banker in general. And John Law, who starts off in this period, is the famous funny money inflation, the first big paper money inflation in history. See, there was no paper money before. The first government paper money ever was 1690 in Massachusetts. Before that, gold was money. The only way the government could do anything was clip the coins, debase the coin. When paper money comes in, it's a great new invention for the government. It means you could just print money ad lib. Essentially, John Law, the Scottish adventurer, gets a hold of the royal government in Paris and convinces them he should be the central banker and print money. And through unlimited inflation, you can wipe out the public debt, you bring prosperity and all the rest of it. So, Cantillon, the legend is that Law goes to Cantillon and says, look, you're the only person here who can challenge me to either join, he says, no, I'll give you 24 hours to get out, or else we'll throw you in the Bastille. Cantillon says, no, it's better for us to join forces. I'll become a lawyer. So he and Law and some other guy named Beau Gage become the 3-man triad running this whole system. So but Cantillon knew the whole system was going to collapse. And what Cantillon did was he loaned a lot of money to these guys at very high interest rates, cashed it in, sold the collateral, and then skipped the country just before the great collapse of the Mississippi bubble. And came back to clean up multi-millions to the great distress and resentment of his fellow law types. So anyway, he made millions out of this. He wrote his book as sort of a reflective response to this experience. The book was very influential, even, as I say, when it was still unpublished in the early 30s, and became published, printed in 1755 after he died, and was read by everybody in France, all the laissez-faire people, all the intellectuals, etc., etc. It was extremely influential. One of the things about Cantillon was he had mansions in every city in Europe, and probably the only economist in history of thought was murdered. I can't think of anybody else except, Solon victim or something like that. He was murdered, presumably by his disappointed servant, skipped town with his jewels or something. At any rate, but Antoine Murphy told me privately, he refuses to publish it because he said he hadn't got enough data on it yet. It's a marvelous story. He claims that Cantillon really didn't die there. He was heavily in debt. He skipped town himself and went to Borneo, where his papers or whatever remained, died 20 years later. But at any rate, yes, great character, marvelous character. Now the thing is about Cantillon, he wasn't an exact pure free trader, but he was really, it matters of that. What he said was, well, if we bring treasure into the kingdom, it will increase, when we spend the money, it will increase prices. So he advised the king not to spend the money. It's really great advice. In other words, all right, we get money coming in, don't spend it, sit on it. So that means we won't have inflation, we won't have this problem of deficits, balance of trade deficits, etc. Okay, after Cantillon, we had the physiocrats in the mid-18th century, who were laissez-faire people, who were quite nutty in many ways and had various deviations. The interesting thing about physiocrats, they were the first probably real sect or school of thought. We know the date at which the school of thought was founded. It was a date, one moment in July 1757, when Dr. Quesnay, the founder, the guru of this thing, met Mirabeau, Count Mirabeau, who was in those days was a Cantillonian, the Cantillon disciple, immediately shifted to Quesnay. And it became a 2-man school of thought. I mean, to have a school of thought, you have at least 2 people. And this was it. Now, the thing is, they're both very highly placed. Quesnay was a physician, distinguished physician. He became the physician of the court, first to the king's top mistress. There was, by the way, a thing that one way to influence the king and try to convert him laissez-faire was to convert the king's top mistress. This was done by Archbishop Fenelon in the early 18th century, late 17th. And Quesnay was a physician to Madame de Pompadour, who was the king's top mistress, and then becomes influential at court. Mirabeau was influential. First of all, he'd just written a massive book called The Friend of Man. It's a multi-part work which is incomprehensible, but the thing is it was very popular because it was written in a 17th century style. Here it is in the mid-18th century, guys writing in mid-17th century style, so it sort of charmed everybody. And it was a bestseller. So Mirabeau and Cantillon, Marquis de Mirabeau, then organized the movement, in Quesnay. They set up their own school of thought, their own journals, their own doctrine. They reviewed each other's books favorably, and so forth and so on. Also, they became sort of a cult of personality. All these guys thought that Quesnay was the top guy of all time. For example, his followers claim that Quesnay looked like Socrates. Kind of difficult to figure out, because we don't really know what Socrates looked like. And they also refer to him as the Confucius of Europe, the great sage of Europe. Mirabeau went so far as to proclaim that the three greatest inventions in the history of mankind were writing, money, and Quesnay's crazy diagram, the tableau économique, for the beginning of input-output analysis, the arrows. So, at any rate, there were natural rights people and laissez-faire people. Unfortunately, the real deviationists were very much in favor of high agricultural prices. One reason I think Quesnay was a farmer and he owned farms. And I think they would have been in favor of farm price supports if anybody proposed it. See, in those days, there were farm price supports the other direction. Farm prices were kept low, and of course they were very much opposed to that. The maximum price controls on farm products. I think they would have been in favor of minimum price control that had come up. Anyway, there were laissez-faire people according to their lights. And their strategic objective, the question is, if you're a laissez-faire person, and this came up in the late 17th century too, what do you do about it? Well, obviously do you have absolute monarchy by this time in France? The thing to do is convert the king. If you convert the king, you can establish laissez-faire from the top, revolution from the top, so to speak, and that would be it. And so the strategic perspective of Fenelon and Turgot too, and the physiocrats, convert the king, he will establish laissez-faire, and that's it. Well, how do you convert the king? Well, first of all, you convert the mistress. One route. How do you convert the king? Well, you have to convince the king it's really in his interest to have a laissez-faire system. So they tended to become utilitarian in that sense. In other words, even though physiocrats are natural rights people, you tend to stress that it's for your benefit too, sire, if the kingdom is prosperous. And the thing is, I'm not sure they're right. I mean, it seems to me the king can make a good case for saying the king's self-interest is to crush his inhabitants, loot every penny, and so forth and so on. So I think you have a problem right there in a strategic perspective. And what happened indeed when Turgot, who was a friend of the physiocrats politically, although not economically, a laissez-faire person politically, Turgot was a top bureaucrat, finally gets in as finance minister in 1774. This is it. They say, well, this is the key. It will win out. And as soon as he starts instituting laissez-faire, he's kicked out, of course, by the vested interests. And so at that point, physiocracy sort of disappears. Also, Quesnay was losing interest in economics. He was not interested in economics until in his 60s. And then he got interested and he formed the cult. By his 80s, or whatever he was when he probably died, he got interested in mathematics. He claimed to have squared the circle, which of course is impossible. Anyway, he claimed to have solved the problem of squaring the circle. Firing of Turgot, I think, really did them in. Now, Turgot, I refer you to as a magnificent person. I've written a pamphlet on this thing, which is available here, I think, from Mises Institute. Turgot was magnificent. He was great. He was my really favorite character in history of thought. Considering also the fact that he was, first of all, he spent very little time in economics. He was a busy top bureaucrat, intendant, governor. And most of his time intellectually was spent on other things, history, linguistics, sort of all-around type. Wrote and read a lot on that topic. Economic topic is only sort of good offhand. He was pressed into it when he had to tell somebody something. For example, his Reflections on Wealth, his longest book, which is about 50 pages, was written under severe time pressure. He was trying to form questions to ask two Chinese students in France about Chinese economy, or preparing them to ask about French economy, I think. And so he wrote this as sort of outline to himself, as a memorandum to himself of what to, preparing questions to ask. This was a great work on wealth and capital theory, etc. So he wrote all of his stuff under severe time pressure, sort of dashed it off, and it's absolutely magnificent. He has the whole Austrian stuff in there. Not only laissez-faire, complete laissez-faire, without any of Smith's evasions, qualifications, etc., but also he's got Austrian time preference theory, he's got Austrian Bombavertian capital theory, he's got money and process analysis, he's got the whole business, and done with brilliance, just sort of in passing almost, a few clauses. And I would strongly recommend any of you, all of Turgot's economic writings have been translated into English by P.T. Groenewegen, who's a Dutch Turgotian expert in New Zealand, I think. And it's called The Economics of A.R.J. Turgot. It's one of these things, a Dutch paperback costing about $60, something like that. It's insanely expensive, but it's worth it. And we've got very good notes and introductions and annotations by Groenewegen, Economics of Turgot. And yeah, it's just remarkable. Schumpeter is very good on Turgot. Turgot, for example, is really the originator of Say's law, Smithian capital, the whole thing about, the supply constitutes the man, etc., etc. All these things are in Turgot. It's fantastic. It's difficult to overestimate his importance and his brilliance in this area. He's also got the entrepreneur in there. As a matter of fact, in a sense, he's a little bit better than Cantillon because he stresses the capitalist entrepreneur as being particularly important. He's got the whole so-called Smithian capital theory and investment and all that, savings and investment theory. He says, well, the important thing is the capitalist entrepreneur. In other words, the person who commits resources and capital to an uncertain world, to entrepreneurship. He's just phenomenal, and he's again extremely influential. As I say, he's got expectations. He's got the whole thing in there. He's also got, by way of law of diminishing returns, beautifully presented. Schumpeter says it was no presentation of law of diminishing returns to equal it until about 1920. It was written about 1760, 1770. All this is forgotten. This whole Turgot corpus drops out of knowledge. Again, talking about lost paradigms. Totally lost until right now, until recently, until 1960 or 70 something. Why it's lost is an interesting story. By the way, along with Turgot, we have Condillac, the brother of Mably, who was a utility theorist and philosopher, who points out very clearly, even more clearly than Turgot, that the exchange comes from double inequality of wealth, double inequality of utility. In other words, the reverse inequality of exchange that I mentioned. Sets that down with absolute priority. There's others like Galiani, who's wrote a great book on money and the age of 23 in 1751. The Abbé Galiani is another great character who's Neapolitan but loved France and spent most of his time in France as a diplomat. His book on money is super. It hasn't not been, only parts of it have been translated, unfortunately, yet. By the way, Galiani was an interesting character. Erratic, witty, and erudite, and is 4.5 feet tall. Became a social lion of the Paris salons. As soon as he got to Paris, he began to sell out. In other words, as soon as he began to get witty and become a social lion, begins to become anti-laissez-faire, gives up his utility theory, and becomes a favorite protection, effective tariff. Anyway, his great work was written before his Parisian experience. Also, I should say, the founding of mathematical economics comes in about 1720. First misfortune on the road to mathematical economics by Bernoulli. I think it's Daniel Bernoulli, a whole bunch of Bernoullis, all of whom were French mathematicians, probability theorists, inventors of the calculus, things like that. Bernoulli arrives at the mathematical theory of the diminishing utility of money purely out of left field. In other words, he wasn't interested in economics at all, either before or since. He just arrived at this as part of his probability calculations, and he's got a whole series of fallacies, of course, wrapped up in this. The diminishing marginal utility of money had already been arrived at by a couple of the Spanish scholastics in the 16th century. What he does, of course, he immediately says, well, as du dx with the supply of money as a x and utility as u. As soon as you do that, you have about at least two major fallacies right there. One is that life is not like the calculus. There's no infinitesimally small actions in life. Everything is discrete. In other words, everything is qualitatively different, and therefore there's no infinitely small steps that we can take. It really tosses that out. It tosses out calculus right there. And the UX thing is a ratio. And since utilities we know is ordinal and not cardinal, there's no such thing as a ratio. You can't. Also, I don't know what it means to have a ratio of utility to money anyway. It doesn't make much sense. But since utility is ordinal and therefore not cardinal, you can't put it into a ratio. You can't equate it to anything either. So the whole series about fallacy piled on fallacy. He also says with no proof or no evidence whatsoever that the utility of money is an inverse proportion, declines in inverse proportion to the quantity of money. First of all, what does it mean, inverse proportion? Second of all, no evidence whatsoever. Some other mathematicians said, no, it's not inverse proportion to quantity of money, it's inverse proportion to the square root of the quantity of money, even more silly. What does this mean? What are you talking about? More or less, much less, what's the evidence for it? Just sort of hot air seems to be the only way to describe this. All he knows about utility of money is it declines. In other words, you have a stock of money, right? As this thing, you have a falling demand curve, so to speak, falling utility, and it declines as each unit, the utility of each unit declines as you add more. That's it. You don't know about this. There's no ratio, there's no inverse, nothing. And then, of course, he thought it was measurable between people, even more fallacious, that somehow you can compare everybody's utility of money and sum it up and add it up and divide it. All these things are precursors of mathematical economics, which we know and love today. It's sort of like the beginning of this stuff. And what we need to say about it Okay, and speculation here is why does the knowledge of Catalan and Turgot drop out? And the whole French utility, laissez-faire, time preference, whatever, tradition, entrepreneurship. And why did people then think that Adam Smith founded economics? See, all this preceded Adam Smith. All these guys wrote before the Wealth of Nations. Kind of like wrote the same year, Commerce and Government. Unfortunately, of course, was forgotten on the great Smithian wave. Why did Smith, as Carter said, make waste and rubbish of 2,000 years of economic thought? And why was he allowed to get away with it? Why did nobody even say that he was doing this? For one thing, see, J.B. Say, who succeeds Turgot in the French tradition, never referred to Turgot and any of these people. He knew them. He was a disciple, basically, of Turgot and Condillac, all these people. He was a classical liberal, laissez-faire person carrying on the battle through the French Revolution and after it. He was not just an economist, he was also a political thinker and an activist. And the question is, why did Say that Smith founded economics? Say was one of the people responsible for the myth. Why didn't he talk about the French tradition? He really disagreed with Smith on almost everything. Really, if you read the book, there's almost nothing Smithian about it. There's no cost of production theory, there's no labor theory. It's all utility and productivity and hardcore laissez-faire. I think there's two explanations. I puzzled over this for quite some time. How the Smith myth originated, why these guys, the knowledge of the French theorists got lost. They were discredited in France itself. Discredited for two reasons. One, because Turgot was locked in with the physiocrats, even though he really wasn't. He was a political ally of the physiocrats. He was not an economic, he was way beyond the physiocrats. He thought that agriculture was the only productive factor of production. Crazy tableau economique. As Turgot didn't believe any of this stuff. But he was linked with the physiocrats politically. And politically, the physiocrats were linked up with an absolute monarchy because their strategic perspective was, in fact, they were in favor of absolute monarchy because it's simple. You convert the king and that's it. You get laissez-faire. Why mess around with democracy and mass movements? Convert the king. And in fact, they tried to convert a whole bunch of kings. The great story about Catherine the Great was very interested in ideas, Western ideas, and she called these people to Russia. Mercier de la Riviere, the great French physiocrat political theorist, natural rights theorist, explain to me, Monsieur Riviere, about what this physiocracy is all about. And he says, well, madam, essentially the laws of nature govern natural rights and laws of nature. She said, what room is there for the king? Well, the king just follows the laws of nature. She says, thank you, Monsieur, you've been very enlightening. Out. I didn't want to hear this. There's no role for the king whatsoever. As a matter of fact, there's one lovable guy, I'll finish up with this, called the Margrave of Baden, who's a physiocrat convert, and he speaks, I think, to not Mercier, but some other, Mirabeau or somebody, and he says, gee, it seems to me there's no role for government at all in your system. You can all be laissez-faire, sort of anarchistic. The guy draws back, no, sorry, we need the government for the framework and blah, 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 etc. And of course, Margrave was perfectly correct. The implications of laissez-faire natural rights, you don't need the government at all. But at any rate, they were in favor of absolute monarchy, the physiocrats. And so after absolute monarchy disappeared, after the French Revolution, they were politically discredited. Nobody wanted to listen to any guy who was in favor of absolute monarchy. And also, of course, the physiocrats, nobody really believed by this time agriculture was the only productive factor because there was a lot of industry growing at the time. So for those two reasons, I think, the physiocrats and Turgot got discredited, unfortunately, in France, and nobody would refer to them, and the knowledge drops out. The paradigm's lost. And the whole thing drops out. It's a real tragedy for economic thought, because then we're stuck for a century, stuck with the British. Essentially, the scholarship alignment begins with Grotius, the same guy I mentioned, the Dutch Protestant scholastic, who were Protestants but natural law people. Grotius was heavily influenced by the Spanish scholastics, like Suarez, etc. What happened is that Pufendorf, who was a Lutheran Grotian, this is early 17th century, I guess Pufendorf is mid. So Grotius is early 17th century and Pufendorf is middle or late. Pufendorf was sort of a popularizer of Grotius, so people would start reading Pufendorf and not Grotius. Grotius mentioned the Spanish scholastics, hailed them as being his predecessors. Pufendorf, being a hardcore Lutheran, hated Catholics, refused to mention any Catholics. As a result, the knowledge of scholastic economics drops out. Scholastic political theory drops out almost forever. Since Pufendorf didn't mention it, and Pufendorf was read by the Scottish Enlightenment people. One reason, by the way, why knowledge of scholastic economics drops out is when Latin drops out. Scholastics, of course, usually wrote in Latin. There are not too many Latinists around. And the fact that de Ruyter and Schumpeter, these people actually read Latin, is one of the reasons why they were able to bring them back. So Pufendorf brings the natural law doctrine and I wouldn't say laissez-faire, sort of semi-free market. It's very vague, but at least it's something. The first Scottish Enlightenment person, the first professor, I forget whether it's Edinburgh or Glasgow, it's one or the other, was Gershom Carmichael. He was only a professor for about 2 years before he died, but he's a professor. When they begin the professorial, before that they were readers or whatever they were, And he translates Pufendorf and writes a commentary. He's the founder of the Scottish political economic wing of the Scottish Enlightenment. And so you get Pufendorf, Carmichael, and Carmichael was the teacher of Francis Hutcheson, who in turn was the teacher of Adam Smith. We have a Carmichael-Smith-Hutcheson connection. By the way, Smith, the famous phrase talks about the never forgotten teacher of Francis Hutcheson, praises him. However, he only praises him in a private letter to the university in Edinburgh. He never talks about Hutcheson as Wealth of Nation or anyplace else. He's part of Smith's Columbus complex. He kind of originated almost everything. At any rate, these guys are really natural law people, Carmichael, Hutcheson, etc. More or less free market and natural rights, more or less. I mean, not hardcore, but sort of soft-core classical liberals, I would say. Hutcheson, by the way, has a very good attack. One of the places where I differ with Hayek strongly on the history of thought is the status of Mandeville. Bernard Mandeville was a Dutch physician who lived in London most of his life, who wrote a Fable of the Bees and other such fables, which Hayek claims originated the idea of spontaneous order and the free market, how the free market works, and so forth and so on. I disagree with that totally. I take the Weiner position, which is Hutcheson's position, which was that essentially Mandeville was not only a statist, but also his Fable of the Bees is really a plea for, sort of a pre-Keynesian plea for the glories of consumption. Saving is really bad, but you benefit the market and benefit society by consuming a lot. Hutcheson had a point, I think, basically pointed out Hutcheson's Mandeville was only against consumption, in favor of libertinism, a libertinist rather than libertarian, so to speak. I think that's the correct interpretation. I think what Weiner points out is that Mandeville was a follow-up book called Letters from Dion or something like that. It becomes explicit, even more explicit than the Fable of the Bees. So we have now, and all these, both Carmichael and Hutcheson were essentially utility theorists, so utility scarcity theorists. Value, economic value is brought about by demand, and demand and supply, and demand is caused by utility, and diminishing utility, and scarcity. In other words, essentially the scholastic position, since they were Protestant scholastics. Now, if this is true, where does the labor theory of value come in? The cost theory and labor theory of value, how does it come in? It's very strange. How does it come in indeed? It's not Hutchesonian, it's not Carmichaelian or whatever. And not only that, but Smith himself, as lectures, gives the correct version. In other words, the basic, the famous paradox of value, which Smith foisted on economic thought. Paradox of value, which is quite famous, is that how come if diamonds, if bread or water, whichever you want to use, is necessary to life, bread is good, the staff of life, or water is good, how come it's very cheap on the market, whereas diamonds, which are frippery and luxury, how come they're so expensive? In other words, you have this famous split between use value, and when it gets to use value, diamonds are terrible and bread is great, but economic value somehow violates that. Smith allegedly couldn't solve this, Ricardo couldn't solve it, so they don't talk about consumption. Consumption just drops out. You have a disastrous split between use value and economic value, which results in Marx and Veblen. The whole thing is a production for use versus production for profit really stems from this idea. Somehow the market values fripperies over important stuff like bread, and in real life, or in real terms, bread is much more valuable. So the usual story is that Smith enunciated this paradox of value, and then the Austrians finally solved it. It's not really true that Hutcheson had solved it, Scholastic had solved it. There's no problem. They realized what the problem was. That diamonds are very scarce. There's lots of bread around. It's very simple. You have an enormous amount of bread, an enormous amount of water. Each unit of water or bread is going to be worth much less than diamonds, which are, even though philosophically weaker, are much more scarce. That's all. It's relative scarcity and utility. It's the whole bit. Not only had Hutcheson solved it, but Smith himself had solved it in his lectures, his unpublished lectures at the time. Smith realized that in the Wealth of Nations, he totally changes it and poses the paradox of value, which then ruins classical economics from then on. And you might say, well, after all, the lectures were 20 years before. Maybe he's assuming that everybody knows the lectures, and then it goes on to this. That's not true, because the lectures were never published in his lifetime, only published fairly recently, 20th century. The whole thing is quite bizarre. We have in Smith not only a decline and loss of economic thought from the French, but also from Hutcheson, and even from himself as previous persona 20 years before. This is true not only of paradox of value, it's also true of the Hume international money flow stuff, where he doesn't even have that. That drops out. The whole idea of the international money equilibrium and all that stuff drops out. It's very strange. The Myth of Wealth of Nations is a weird book. Because embodies not only is it not true that he did not create economics, but he lost a lot of economics even from his own previous 20 years ago, his own previous being, whatever you want to call it, 20 years before. Smith was growing up, but Smith was a young man in the 1750s. Scottish Enlightenment hit Scotland, so that universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow become the shining lights, intellectual lights in Europe, especially in Britain. At this point, Oxford and Cambridge had degenerated into sort of rich man's playthings or whatever. They're not intellectually important or good at that, or useful at that time. And so, as a result, Edinburgh and Glasgow become key centers, and people come from all over Europe to study there. Smith was started off as a clubman. Clubs are very important in 18th century social life, intellectual life, and everything. He was a member of about 8 different clubs, each of which had weekly meetings and things like that. There was one club, by the way, when David Hume, his friend David Hume was president, the two were very different. They never spoke on art. They were obviously the smartest for all their disagreements with them. They're certainly the brightest people in the club. At any rate, so there's a big club life and intellectual life developing, plus the fact that we had a titanic struggle between and within the Church of Scotland, which was the established church, the typical British compromise. The Anglicanism was the established church in England, and Presbyterianism was the established church in Scotland, which angered the Anglicans in Scotland, of course, tremendously, and drove them into the Jacobite camp, by the way. And of course, the pure Calvinists, or whatever, the dissident faction, broke off and established the Free Kirk of Scotland. At any rate, in the established Scottish Presbyterian Church, there was a titanic struggle between the moderates, as they were called, and the evangelicals. The moderates consisted of all the bright people and wealthy types in Scotland, and Glasgow and Edinburgh, and the evangelicals everybody else. The oppressed rural masses. As a result of fantastic maneuvering, even though the moderates were in the minority, they were able to control the church until about 1800. That was for approximately 50 years or so. Headed by Principal Robertson, William Robertson, a whole bunch of other people of whom Smith was a member. And they all knew each other, and they all were friends and compatriots. Even though the moderates were not as hardcore Calvinists, obviously, as the evangelicals, they were still pretty Calvinistic, especially Smith. Hume was not the least. Hume, I guess, was tending toward deism or atheism or whatever. Hume couldn't find an academic post in Scotland, by the way. Interesting commentary on academia. A guy couldn't find a university post because of his religious views. He was not impoverished, however, since he was a high aristocrat, independently wealthy aristocrat, member of the Hume family, which I think emerged now in Douglas Hume and all that. It's all the same group. So Smith starts off in this environment, however, was also deeply Calvinist, even though moderate. His mother wanted him to become an Anglican minister and sent him to Oxford, I believe, in order to, as part of an Anglican fellowship. When you graduate, you're supposed to become an Anglican minister, and he said, heck with that. When he became a Glasgow professor, he had to sign the Westminster Confession, which was one of the requisites, and he had no difficulty, apparently, signing it. I think this accounts, well, not only for his adoption of labor theory of value late in the game, and discarding the utility theory, also for other things. One of his deviations from laissez-faire, one of his many deviations, I'll get into in a minute, was he was in favor of usury laws. In other words, he was in favor of maximum interest rate laws, restricting the supply of credit. Eddie West was a friend of mine, who was a biographer of Smith and worshipped Smith, Edwin G. West, couldn't understand this. He said, when we had a discussion at the Catalan conference, where Smith, of course, came in as a general object of attention. West said, well, gee, Smith deviated. He should have understood that if you have a maximum, like maximum price control, if you have a maximum interest rate, it will restrict the supply of credit and so forth. And he didn't seem to realize that. It's sort of a hole in his doctrine. Roger Garrison, who gave a comment on that, was an Austrian, pointed out, quite the contrary, Smith understood all too well what the consequence was. And he wanted to restrict the supply of credit. That's the whole point. He understood that usury laws would restrict the supply of credit, and he loved it. He wanted to do it. Why? Because he hated consumption. He wanted credit to be channeled into the prime borrowers who would pay prime interest rates, the low interest rate borrowing. He wanted to exclude from credit. He wanted to ration credit so that speculators and high consumer types, and with non-Calvinist types, would not get credit. He wanted to channel credit away from dissolute types, okay? And was quite conscious on his part, and I think it's absolutely correct. Even when he gets to the diamond water or diamond bed paradox, the way he talks about it is kind of interesting. He doesn't say that diamonds are a luxury and therefore of lesser value. He says diamonds are of no value. No value. And he's a constant thing with Smith is an attack on consumption and an attack on immaterial consumption. And one of the reasons I think why he adopts the idea that some labor is productive, labor which is engaged, which embodies material objects, and other labor which is unproductive, in other words, services. He wasn't so much interested in material objects. He was interested in capital. He wanted capital investment. In other words, he disagreed with the time preference, the saving consumption preferences of the market. He wanted more saving and less consumption, basically. And one of the ways, usury laws is one way to channel consumption into prime borrowers. And in general, he disliked consumption, fripperies. He wanted to tax consumption. He wanted all sorts of ways by which he would, restructure the preferences of the market. And it all fits in with what I postulate as the Calvinist approach to all this, where luxury becomes evil. Anything beyond some moderate consumption becomes wicked. So that was one of his deviations. The idea of productive labor fits right into that, building up capital investment. It's sort of the opposite deviation from the physiocratic Mandeville one, where only consumption is good and saving is evil. This is the opposite. And a lot of free market economists, by the way, still hold this. As a matter of fact, if you read any economic literature, financial literature, the supply-siders, for example, will say we have to lower marginal tax rates because we want people to save and invest more. Saving and investment good, but if saving and investment good, then the consumption must be in some way bad. Therefore, people are adjusting their own proportions. And so, a lot of this, you'll get the same sort of, even now, the same sort of idea that saving good and, of course, consumption bad is not really explicitly stated, but, of course, is part of the paradigm. In other words, very few people are willing to allow the market, individuals in the market to decide their own saving investment preferences. In addition to the fact that it leaves out the productive labor stuff, creates a lot of problems. Theory of value is totally confused. He's a very confused writer. The theory of value is about 3 or 4 independent coexisting theories of value in there. On one hand, he puts too much emphasis on the division of labor to neglect of investment of capital. On the other hand, in his later books, toward the end of the book, he attacks the division of labor as causing alienation and all the rest of the stuff. In other words, he's sort of a pre-Marxian anti-alienation. One of the things, by the way, one of the reasons why he worries about the division of labor is it weakens the martial spirit of the people. If you're there, I don't know, if you're making parts of the pin or you're tightening bolts, you'll somehow lose the spirit of going out and conquering. And he's in that sense, very pro-war, something that's fairly overlooked. And his theory of money leaves out even the Hume stuff, much less the Cantillon stuff on money and prices. He leaves out a lot of stuff. He leaves out a lot of stuff that either he had or Hutcheson had previously. I have a list of a compilation of deviations from laissez-faire of Smith. They're pretty long. I'll tell you that. Of course, there's the Navigation Acts, there's national defense, which include practically everything. The martial spirit decay. He's in favor of government-run education in order to inculcate obedience to the state among the populace. Scarcely a laissez-faire doctrine. Quoting from Smith, an instructed and intelligent people, besides, are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one. They feel themselves more respectable and more likely to obtain the respect of their lawful superiors, says Smith, and they are therefore more disposed to respect those superiors. They are less apt to be misled in any wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. That's why he's in favor of government-run education. It's kind of a status, let's face it. Nonsense about him being a laissez-faire person. He's in favor of regulating bank paper, allowing fractional reserve banking, which most of his predecessors were against, by the way, including Hume. Hume was a hardcore 100% gold person. He thought old banking, fractional reserve banking was fraud. Most of his friends and his predecessors did. It was only Smith who started bringing in bank credit. He's in favor of public works, including highways, bridges, and harbors. On the rationale that private enterprise would, quote, would not have the incentive, unquote, to maintain them properly, a rather odd position to take. And a particularly lengthy list of taxes which he advocated, each of which interfered in the free market. For example, he's sort of a pre-Georgist, as Ricardo was definitely a pre-Georgist. See, all these guys, including Smith, believe that the landlord had no function. And the farmers had a function, but landlords, just ownership of land was functionless, and therefore can be taxed. It's a tax on rent. The whole smearing of rent, the whole vicious smear of rent, which really starts with Smith, and of course Ricardo maximizes it. But they didn't understand, for example, that landlords perform a very important function, namely allocating scarce land. I mean, it's an extremely important function, which they didn't think in terms of allocation. He also favored taxes on import of foreign manufacturers, moderate taxes on the export of raw wool. A lot of, even within the free trade thing, he had a lot of deviations on that. And heavy taxes on luxurious consumption, as I mentioned. Taxes on luxury carriages. Specifically, to, quote, tax the indolence and vanity of the rich, unquote. Once again, the Calvinist thrust. It also has, a puritanical hostility to liquor, which even though he's not a post-millennialist, but the anti-liquor thing was already there. He called for heavy tax on distilleries in order to crack down on hard liquor and induce people to drink instead of the, quote, wholesome and invigorating liquor of beer and ale. Somehow that was okay, whereas hard liquor was evil, sin. But even on ale, he was in favor of a high retail tax on retail sales of all liquor to discourage ale houses. And of course, he's also in favor of the soak the rich policy, progressive income taxation. Let it never be forgotten with Smith. I mean, who would wear a Smith tie after this, right? Also, I say usury laws I've already gotten into, even though Turgot and Cantillon already blasted usury laws off the face of the map. Even Bentham was against usury laws. Even Bentham was one of my least favorite people also. Now, the interesting thing about Smith, one of the most interesting, sort of charming things, is an article by Anderson, Gary Anderson, I think Tollison was involved in this thing, right? A marvelous article called Adam Smith and the Custom House. See, one of the interesting things about Smith, he was this great free trade, laissez-faire person. How come he spent the last 12 years of his life as a customs official, not just a customs official, but a member of the customs commissioners, running the whole customs system, you know, extracting tariffs and all that, cracking down on smugglers. So how do you square this? Now, the usual whitewash of Smith is, well, he just uses it as a sinecure. It's called a no-show job. Like in the Bronx, we have pothole inspectors. For $8,000 a year, if you find a pothole, you report it, you call in. This is a pothole every 5 yards. It's very easy to do this. So, but it turns out, however, it was not a no-show job. He worked hard at it. He was there 3 days a week, and it was full-time, you know, and he loved it. Not only that, he had no qualms about it. He loved it. He was writing letters to people saying, boy, oh boy, we got another smuggler today, and we were cracking down on these people. It's sort of like Reagan claiming he's against income taxes and maximizing IRS funds and power. Right? And you ask yourself, well, which is he really in favor of? Well, you look at his actions. Speak louder than the words here. Some people claim, well, it's too bad that Smith didn't do any more academic work and the intellectual work of the wealth of the nation. But he said, no, he loved this. He could have gotten a top academic post with almost as much money. He liked this stuff. It was great. Somebody went to Scotland, I don't know if Anderson or something, found the minutes of the customs house and actually found out what he was saying and what he was doing, cracking down. Just one quote from Smith. He writes to a fellow customs official in December 1785, and he says, "It may perhaps give the gentleman pleasure," I mean the guy he's writing to be informed that the net revenue arising from the customs in Scotland is at least 4 times greater than it was 7 or 8 years ago when he took over. It has been increasing rapidly these 4 or 5 years past, and the revenue of this year is overleaped by at least 1/2 the revenue of the latest former year. I find myself as likely to increase still further. Well, God bless him. Hardly, however, a champion of laissez-faire and free trade. And he gets this undeserved reputation of being the founder of economics, and the other guys are lost. And we come to some Smithians now. I think there's Dougal Stewart, for example, was Smith's descendant in the University of Glasgow. Very few people study under Smith himself, but everybody you can think of studied under Stewart. For about 10 or 15 years, he was a big shot professor of political economy at Glasgow. James Mills studied under him, and a whole bunch of other people, McCulloch and the whole Scottish group. When we get to the labor theory of value, it's pretty clear that the propounders of labor theory of value, not only Smith, but also his direct descendants, James Mill, who was Scottish, originally a top Scottish Calvinist who was studying for the Presbyterian ministry. And as somebody said, when James Mill went to London, he lost his Calvinist faith. He became an atheist, but he continued the same zeal for world salvation and crushing the enemy or whatever they had before. His cadre doctrines continued apace. As a matter of fact, there's a great quote about James Mill is that when he was a hardcore Calvinist, he hated Hume for his skepticism. And when he was an atheist, he also hated Hume for the same reason. Hume was too middle-headed and skeptical, and so it wasn't hardcore enough. It's kind of a charming doctrine. Okay, well, Bentham was a Smithian, started off life as a Smithian, devoted Smithian, and he wrote his only good book, I think, is Defense of Usury, in which he attacked Smith for selling out on the usury question. He wrote that in the 1790s when he was a devoted Smithian. Bentham, of course, was not the founder, but probably the big systematizer of utilitarianism, a bitter opponent of natural rights, natural law, whatever. When you have to cut through the Benthamite movement, a whole bunch of Benthamites around, you cut through, you find the core of Benthamism, which is pretty monstrous. Of course, Bentham really is the founder of modern economics, the sense of welfare economics, cost-benefit analysis. It all comes in with Bentham. These people, James Mill and John Stuart Mill, are essentially Benthamites and bring in the Benthamite, replacing whatever natural law doctrine there was. And I think it's all fallacious. I mean, the personal utilitarianism is fallacious, and certainly social utilitarianism, where you try to add up personal utilities and personal benefits and figure out what the maximum general greatest good for the greatest number is. It's obvious nonsense. You can't add them up, since all utilities are subjective and ordinal. Bentham's famous phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number, which is sort of the cornerstone of his doctrine. One of the problems with that, of course, one of the many problems, is supposing you're in a lesser number, then what? What happens then? Utilitarianism can justify almost everything. I think Benthamites would admit this. In other words, since there's no justice, no such thing as natural rights, justice, or anything else, it's all manipulating everything for alleged cost-benefit arguments. For example, take the idea, say, on punishment theory, which is an arcane part of libertarian doctrine. The Benthamites, of course, pure deterrence theorists. They don't believe in justice. It's all deterrence. Well, deterrence doesn't have, for example, to deter. Take, for example, this sort of situation. Most people don't want to commit murder for whatever reason. They don't like it. They're against it. They're reluctant to commit murder. On the other hand, a lot of people are willing to steal an apple from a push cart or from a fruit store. Therefore, according to pure deterrence theory, punishment for murder should be very light, and punishment for apple stealing should be capital punishment, preferably in public, to make an example of the stealer. And most of us think there's something wrong with this. It's what the philosophers call counterintuitive. Or it was nutso. Most of us have a view of justice, even if we don't have an articulated theory of it. Bentham throws that all out. Benthamites also are in favor, for example, of punishing the innocent. Execute the innocent, provided the public doesn't know they're innocent. If the public thinks they're guilty, it's good enough, right? Why not? There are no moral principles and whatever. What I want to talk about with Bentham is the panopticon, which is the key to his thought, which Benthamites don't like to talk about. This is Bentham's great project. He was a great projector. He wrote millions of words, much of which, fortunately, have not been published yet. He had a fleet of secretaries, very wealthy, aristocrat, and so we had employed secretaries to take them down, copy them. There was no, of course, Xerox machine or typewriter at that epoch. He was sort of a living reductio absurdum of his own, his panopticon was a living reductio absurdum of his own thought. He used to be a Tory. He was a Tory aristocrat. He converted to democracy, actually converted by James Mill, because the Tories wouldn't adopt his doctrine, his panopticon. He figured nothing could be worse than that. Maybe a democracy will adopt my panopticon. Panopticon was a theory which Benthamite apologists claim only applied to prisons. It did not apply only to prisons. There's an excellent, very amusing article. There's a lot of good stuff. There's Douglas Long has a book called Bentham and Liberty, a very good scholarly work. Gertrude Himmelfarb, usually not one of my favorite people, being a neoconservative, has an excellent critique of Bentham called The Haunted House of Jeremy Bentham in her book on Victorian minds. Panopticon was a scheme not just for the prisoner, for almost everybody, for the poor, for children, for vagrants. I mean, everybody would be rounded up. It's been estimated by Bentham himself that from a third to two-thirds of the population would be incarcerated in panopticons, which were essentially compulsory concentration camps. It was nice with scientifics. There's no such thing as justice or privacy. It's all cost benefit, right? You maximize surveillance.
Your attention, please. Here are two announcements. Ice cream is now on sale for your enjoyment. The flavor of the day is strawberry. Here is a warning. There is a possibility of light intermittent showers later in the day. Thank you for your attention.
Beautiful day. They didn't settle for ages. Now they wouldn't leave for the world.
You mean you brought them around to your way of thinking?
They had a choice. Wait! Wait! Be still! Turn back!
What was that?
That would be telling.
Calling number 2, ready for you at the labor exchange.
Be right with you. Come along, my dear fellow.
And so you have one guy sitting in the center of a circle, and all the prisoners and kids and whatever you want, paupers, are all lined up so you can see into them. And of course, this was before the age of television and all that. A brilliant prophecy of the Orwellian future. Even though you couldn't see everybody every time, nobody would know when you're seeing them, so everybody would feel he's under surveillance. Bentham felt as a utilitarian. It's very important for everybody to feel at all times he's under surveillance by Big Brother, okay, by the panopticon leadership. And so this would keep them, not only keep them on the straight and narrow, keep them working to the maximum. We want to get maximum production out of them. Let's see, 12 and a half hours a day at forced labor and so forth and so on. And he had everything beautifully worked out. The idea, of course, to have maximum production by these slave labor, which is essentially what it was. Panopticon, by the way, is Greek for all seeing. That's the controller who sees everything. Something like the old Big Brother. Also, inspection house is another way to put it. This is a big reform. Himmelfarb puts it very neatly. He said Bentham by this time was an atheist. But she says Bentham did not believe in God, but he did believe in the qualities apotheosized in God. The Panopticon was a realization of the divine ideal, spying out the ways of the transgressor, or potential transgressor, by means of an ingenious architectural scheme, turning night into day with artificial light and reflectors, holding men captive by an intricate system of inspection.